What's up, y'all? Welcome back to Fish the Moment. Winter is fast approaching, and one of my favorite baits to throw in the winter time is a crankbait. And so in this video, I want to talk to you about my 5 favorite winter crankbait areas that will help you put a lot of big bass in the boat all winter long. So let's get into it. Number 1, Riprap. So first up, let's talk about my number 1 area to throw a crankbait in the wintertime, and that's man-made riprap. And riprap is basically just big rocks that people put up against the shore to protect against the bank erosion that'll happen when the waves and the wind hit against the bank. And usually these riprap areas have rock that extends 5 to 15 feet into the lake, and even when lakes are drawn down in the wintertime, like a lot of them are, there's usually still 3 or 4 feet of riprap that's in the water. And the great thing about riprap and any sort of rock cover in the winter is that it's going to hold heat from sunny days, and so the water around any sort of rocks or riprap is going to be warmer in the mornings as well as in the afternoon when you have bright sunny days. And one common misconception about winter fishing, especially in the south, is that the fish are going to be living offshore and in deep water. But that's definitely not the case, and even when water temperatures are 40 degrees, you can catch fish on riprap banks and rocky banks in 3 to 4 feet of water when you have that sun out. And what will happen is that those fish will gravitate to those rocks for the warmth, even though they're in shallow water, and they'll ambush any bait fish or crawfish that might be poking their heads out of the rocks or swimming around the rocks. And so what I'll do is I'll take a bait like a flat-sided crankbait or a square-bill crankbait and fish at a 45-degree angle to the riprap. And I'll make my 45-degree cast to the riprap, and I'll slowly reel my bait back to the boat. And the key to fishing riprap in the wintertime, especially with a crankbait, is to reel your bait slowly. You basically can't reel it slow enough in my experience. And what I like to do is actually use a 5-to-1 gear ratio bait casting reel. And I'm just going to basically turn my handle just enough at the beginning of the cast to get that bait to tick the rocks. Then I'm just going to barely turn that handle and keep contact with those rocks. You want that crankbait actually digging into the rocks, but you don't want it to basically go too quickly across the rocks, or those lethargic winter bass won't eat it. And you probably have riprap in a lot of different areas of your lake, and I find that the best riprap is riprap that's close to relatively deep water, let's say 8 to 9 feet of water. And if you can find riprap that's close to 30 feet of water, that's even better. What will happen is these fish will sit in that little bit deeper water for most of the day, and then when the sun comes up, they'll move up onto the rocks, feed, and then pull back off. And so you'll have a maybe 2 to 3 hour feeding window a lot of times where these fish will be on the riprap, and then after that they will pull back out and suspend in that deeper water. And another good place to look for riprap is around bridges and also the mouths of pockets. And so if you can find bridges or riprap in the mouths of pockets, those are going to be your key places to locate these winter bass. Number 2, rock transitions. Next up are rock transitions, and these are classic areas to throw a crankbait in the wintertime, especially in the Ozarks as well as over in Tennessee where you have the deep, clear lakes with rocky banks. And these also work on shallower, dirtier reservoirs as well. And a rock transition is basically any place where you go from one size rock or one type of rock to another type of rock. That might mean that you transition from a bluff wall to a 45-degree bank with some slate rock, maybe from some slate rock to some chunk rock, maybe from chunk rock that's the size of a softball to some pea gravel size rock, or any sort of transition from one type of rock to another. And the bass will actually set up on different rock transitions at different points in the wintertime. And so a lot of times when the water is really cold, let's say 40 degrees, the bass will be closer to the transitions from the bluff walls to the 45-degree banks. Then as water temperatures warm up into the mid to high 40s, they'll get to more of the 45-degree chunk rock banks, maybe where it transitions to pea gravel. And then as the water temperatures get into the mid 50s and they're about to spawn, they'll be a lot closer to that pea gravel and maybe transitioning into the back of the pockets. And so you kind of have to play it by ear as to which type of rock transition the fish are on a given day, but usually you can crank these rock transitions with baits like a square-bill crankbait. A storm wiggle wart is a classic. The Spro RkCrawler is really great and it gets a little bit deeper. I like to throw the KVD 1.5 flat side crankbait. Now I'm throwing all these baits in crawfish patterns. It seems like a crawfish colored crankbait in these rock transitions works really, really well. And to find these rock transitions, a lot of times you can just look at the bank and see where the rock transitions on the shoreline from one type of rock to another. And this is a really easy way to identify them. And another way to actually find them before you get to the lake is to use Google Earth. And if your lake is drawn down in the wintertime, a lot of times you can easily see these transition points from one type of rock to another. And I'll mark those with my pins on Google Earth, transfer the waypoints over, and I'll link a video down below in the description about how to do that. But it's a great way to find rock transitions before you get to the lake. But if you are trying to find some while you're there, just drive through a couple creeks. You'll see them pretty easily, and you've seen some examples here of me fishing them. And so these are great areas to catch really good fish in the wintertime, and it's definitely something you should be checking out. Number 3, offshore rock piles. Next up are offshore rock piles, and offshore rock piles are a little bit harder to find than the first two areas I talked about, but they can be just as productive, and a lot of times they'll have bigger groups of fish on them. And I find offshore rock piles on all types of offshore structure, from points, ledges, humps, a lot of different places. And these offshore rock piles are basically places where you have some bigger rock that is surrounded by smaller rock or maybe sandy bottom. And just like the riprap that we talked about at the beginning of the video, these rocky areas are going to hold heat. And so on sunny day, these fish will pull up on top of the points, on top of the ledges, and get around these rock piles. And they'll feed on the crawfish and the shad they're using them. And a lot of times, the rock piles I fish in the winter aren't actually that deep. Even though they're offshore, they may only be 10 feet of water or less. And the reason for that is because you need to have the sun penetrate enough into the water to heat up those rocks. If you find a rock pile that's in 30 feet of water, a lot of times that sun's not going to penetrate down and warm up those rocks, and it kind of defeats the purpose. And so most of my good offshore rock piles in the winter are going to be, let's say, 6 to 7 feet or less. And I'm going to find them, again, in the mouths of pockets, maybe even halfway back in a creek. And they're going to be away from the bank, offshore, but they're not going to be super deep. And so that is, again, one common misconception about winter bass fishing, is that you need to fish in 20, 30, 40 feet of water to catch fish. But a lot of times you can actually fish in 6 or 7 feet of water if you're around some sort of rock cover or grass that we'll talk about here in a second that holds heat. And so if you can find these offshore rock piles that are shallow enough to absorb the heat from the sun, you can find some really good groups of fish and catch some really big largemouth as well in the wintertime on these crankbaits. And when I'm fishing these offshore rock piles, I like to throw crankbaits that dive between 5 and 15 feet deep, depending on the depth. And usually my rule of thumb is if the rock pile is in 5 foot of water, I want a crankbait that dives 8 feet deep. If it's in 10 feet of water, I want a crankbait that dives 13 feet deep, basically 3 feet deeper than the rock pile is, just because I want to make sure I can keep that bait down in the rocks and reel it slow enough to keep that bait down there. And so you want to go a little bit deeper on your crankbaits than the actual water you're fishing. And some of my go-to crankbaits are the Spro RkCrawler, the Storm Wiggle Wart, a Rapala DT10 and DT14, as well as a Norman Deep Little N crankbait. And so all these crankbaits I'll be throwing in a crawfish color or a shad pattern, and usually it doesn't matter which color you're throwing, as long as you get around a rock pile that has some fish, you're going to catch some really good ones. And when I'm looking for these rock piles offshore, I'm almost exclusively going to use my side imaging on my Fishfinder. And I'll just graph through creeks and pockets now in the main lake and look for areas where you see these clumps of black spots. These are actually the shadows they're cast by the rocks when the transducer from your Fishfinder hits the top of the rock and then casts a shadow behind it. And I'll get into this more in an upcoming video where I explain how to actually find fish with your side imaging, and sometimes you can actually see fish in the shadows of these rocks. And so I'll talk about that more in another video, but for right now, if you see the image you see here on your Fishfinder, you know you found a good rock pile, and they'll probably have some good fish around it. Number 4, grass. Next up is grass, or like northern anglers like to call it, weeds. And this is any type of aquatic vegetation like milfoil, hydrilla, coontail, other types of grass that are in your lake. And I'm always looking for grass that's alive and that's green, because this grass will hold some oxygen and it'll also hold really good heat from the sun, just like the rocks will. And some of you might think that it's a little bit weird that I'm throwing a crankbait which has treble hooks around grass. You might think, well, you're just going to get balled up in the grass and get your bait fouled up every single cast. Well, a lot of times in the wintertime, especially if you're fishing around grass like hydrilla or milfoil, it's pretty easy to actually get your crankbait hung in the grass on purpose and then rip it out, freeing the hooks and the bait from the grass, and then letting it fall back down in the grass, ripping it out, letting it fall back down. And this is a really popular technique on a lot of lakes all around the country, especially down like Sam Rayburn, Lake Gunnersville, Lake Washita here in Arkansas. And usually when I'm throwing in these grassy areas are lipless crankbaits again, or some sort of medium diving crankbait like a Norman Deep Little N, that Spro RkCrawler, something like that. And when I'm fishing offshore grass, I'm usually looking for areas where the grass is growing away from the bank in 3 to 15 feet of water, or basically as deep as the grass will grow. And I'm usually looking for two types of areas: ditches and high spots. And a ditch is basically a place where you have some deeper water running into a flat. And I do have a video explaining all different types of offshore structures that you can check out using the link in the description below. And basically these fish will set up in these ditches. They're a little bit deeper and they are going to be a little more protected from the elements, the cold weather. And then when they want to feed, they'll pull up out of the ditch onto the edge of the grass and feed. And these are great places to find big groups of bass stacked up in the winter, but a lot of times they're very hard to find. And in general with grass fishing, it can be a little bit difficult to find fish just because there's so much grass everywhere. And so my recommendation is to focus more on what's on the bottom, the structure, rather than the grass itself. Because you may find a ton of areas with a lot of green grass, but you're only going to find a few areas where you have nice structure like a ditch or a high spot, plus the good green grass. And then the other area I mentioned is a high spot, which is basically a hump or maybe a place where you have a rock pile with some grass around it, and they'll also hold heat, and those fish will move up there to feed. And so fishing offshore grass, or just grass in general in the winter, can be a little bit frustrating because the fish will group up in very small areas in the grass, and you may fish 2-3 miles of grass before you find one little pot of fish. But when you do find them, you usually catch a lot of really good ones doing it, so it's definitely worth the wait. Number 5, offshore brush piles. And then last but not least are offshore brush piles. And offshore brush piles can be a great place to catch fish on a crankbait in the wintertime, especially when the water temperatures are hovering around the 50-degree mark. It seems like once those temperatures drop below 50 degrees, it's a lot easier to catch fish out of brush piles on an Alabama rig or a jig or a drop shot. But when those water temperatures are still around 50 degrees, a lot of times you can throw a medium to deep diving crankbait through brush piles and catch some really big fish. And here's what an offshore brush pile looks like on the side imaging from your Fishfinder. And again, I'll be making videos about how to find fish in a brush pile, in a rock pile, using your side imaging coming next week. But for now, just know that this is what it looks like on the side imaging, and then on the down imaging, you can also see this brush pile, and a lot of times you'll actually be able to see some dots right around the brush pile, and you'll know that these are fish. And usually what I do in the winter is just graph around both offshore and in the creeks, looking for a group of bass that have set up on a brush pile. And then I will pull up on the brush pile, take my deep diving crankbait, throw it over the top of the brush pile, and then reel it through the brush pile. And I've actually made a video about how to retrieve a crankbait through brush piles, and again, links in the description below. There's a lot of videos, guys, on my channel that I've made about a lot of different topics, so if you do have any questions about what I talk about in this video, or want to just learn more about bass fishing, go to my YouTube channel and then just search through my videos. I guarantee you there's probably a video related to almost every topic you could think about, and they'll help you out this winter. But with these offshore brush piles, a lot of times it can be a really great way to catch multiple fish off of one spot and also catch some really big fish, though you may have to pull out the plug knocker and bang a few crankbaits out of the brush pile with that thing. But definitely worth it, and if you can find these good brush piles with your graph, you can put some really big fish in the boat. So guys, that's pretty much it. those are 5 areas where you can go catch good bass all winter long on crankbaits. And just because it's cold and you're bundled up in gloves and hats and stuff like that, don't be afraid to throw reaction baits like a crankbait. Just remember to reel them very slow and maintain bottom contact or contact with the cover, and you're going to be putting a lot of good fish in the boat all winter long. So hope you enjoyed this video. I'll be making a lot more winter fishing videos coming up on the channel, as well as videos about electronics, all kinds of stuff. And so hope you guys are subscribed to the channel. You also like the videos, it really helps me out. And also leave a comment down below if you have any questions, or just to tell me about how you've done with crankbaits into wintertime before, and maybe some areas that I didn't talk about in this video. So thanks again for checking out the video, and I'll see you all in the next one.